What do I feel defines the entire composition of a human being? Well, as this question is being posed to me as an atheist, I suppose the most appropriate way to answer is to answer in a way that distinguishes my view from the theists. Of course, since this isn't a question pertaining directly to the existence or non-existence of God, there's going to be some overlap of ideas. For instance, there are many spiritual people who don't believe in God, but who do believe in souls of some kind, or some kind of dualism. And I don't see any necessary contradiction between a belief in a personal God and a materialist view of the mind and body. But for myself, I see the human being, much as everyone else does, self-ambulatory assemblies of matter endowed with apparatus which allow the interface of a thing we call the mind with a thing we call reality. And the main difference, I suspect, between myself and most theists is that I have no belief in a literal soul. I use the word soul poetically occasionally, but I don't really mean it as anything like theists do, treating it as spirit stuff of some sort. Philosophy of mind is not a strong suit of mine, I have to admit, but I do think of the mind as an emergent and obviously supervenient property of the brain. Some sort of byproduct of the function of various elements of organic hardware, selected because they were good at surviving, reproducing, and amalgamated into a thing called the central nervous system. So in essence, a human being comes down to matter, yes, but there is more to it that meets the eye. Absolutely. There's the notion of self, the fact that this clump of matter possesses a thing called awareness of its environment, and through that it can infer things about that environment and predict how it will be in the future. It can engage in a process or activity we call deliberation, and because of a thing called intentions, it can affect the environment to suit its needs and satisfy a thing we call desires. So in my naive view of the mind is to the body as music is to sound. So with that notion of mind and an obvious understanding of what the body is, I say a human being is the composite of mind and body, each entangled in the other, and insofar as we are conceiving of a thing we call human, inseparable from each other. A blastocyst is not human, and at some point, well before the machines were shut off, neither was Terry Schiavo, probably. Second, purpose. Again, as the question is posed to me as an atheist, I'll answer with the assumption that this is addressing the idea of some sort of meaning to life, a meta-narrative in which we all belong and all have a fixed and decided role. So to answer it, I feel compelled to elaborate on my view of purpose as a concept, a generic idea. Purpose is a fluid thing. I think this is one of the most fundamental mistakes about purpose and meaning, that is to think of them as static. I was having a conversation along these lines with a fellow student, and I took an empty Coke bottle off the table between us and asked, "This is a bottle. What is its purpose?" He said, "To contain liquid," and I said, "Yes, to keep your drink out of your lap and help you get it into your mouth when you want it there." And this other student agreed. He said, and I said, "But it's empty now." He said, "Well, its purpose is the same, even if it's not being used for that." And I said, "So its use is irrelevant to its purpose?" And he said, "Yes." So I got up, walked to one of the doors, and closed it, wedging the bottle between the door and jamb so that it was held open. I asked him, "Now, what is its purpose?" It seemed fairly obvious that it was a bottle and that bottles are designed to hold liquids, and that may be their intended use, but purpose seems a matter of context. Because if someone had walked along and said, "Why is that bottle wedged between the door and the jamb?" we wouldn't have really had to think very much on the subject before we answered perfectly comfortably, saying, "To prevent the door closing." Purpose is a matter of context. New intentions can be added and old intentions can be taken away. And I know of no reason to think that human life is any different. But a person might object, "But a human being has all those things you listed in response to the first question. It has its own intentions, its own desires, it can deliberate for itself. An inanimate object cannot." Well, I have to concede that point. Purpose for an object we would call human can be self-assigned, but this does not preclude the possibility of another person coming along and commandeering that role. That is to say, that a human being can be treated instrumentally. Just consider what billions of people do every day in order to survive. They hand themselves over to be used instrumentally in exchange for the means to continue eating. And this says nothing of the extreme, slavery, in which a person's will is all but entirely subordinated to the will of another. So what I'm getting at here is that I think purpose, in the sense that theists conceive it, is incoherent in the face of what we're witness to every day. The origins of purpose seem obviously to spring up in the minds of conscious beings, and are clearly a matter of context, so it has what we might conceive of as a limited range. For instance, what is the purpose of Alpha Centauri? Can you think of one? Neither can I. At least not a good one. I mean, I could say it exists so that I could casually refer to it in arguments about purpose, but we all find something repugnant about that notion, don't we? Go out in your yard, dig down 20 feet, and pick up a stone and ask yourself, what is its purpose? Couldn't it have just as easily not existed? Does it have a purpose? I think that if a theist is honest, he has to admit that his worldview would say that it does, and yet he feels inclined to disagree. And so do I. Now let's bridge the gap between the inanimate and the living. Consider a mosquito. Does it have a purpose? Does an individual mosquito have some objective purpose? What about a cat? What about a person? What about this person? And this person? What about this person? What about this guy? Does he have a purpose? It's funny that we want to start answering yes the moment the object is able to assign purposes of his own to himself and to others, and I think that's telling. What about the human race as a whole, though? Does it have a purpose? So long as we're asking for an objective purpose, I answer consistently throughout. No, there is no objective purpose to anything I know. To your third question, do I think anything extraordinary happens when one dies? Not really. People die all the time, and whatever happens when they do is certainly ordinary. But that's kind of an evasion. Honestly, yes, I do think something rather extraordinary happens. A consciousness is snuffed out. A thing which was aware no longer is. That discontinuity between awareness and unawareness baffles me. The only way I can approach it is in reverse. You see, I don't find anything odd about the fact that I didn't exist in 1960. It's going to be the same way in 2160. I think of the mind and body as fibers in a rope, and there are some bundle theorists out there who just got hard-ons. The atoms of my being were scattered until some chance happenings brought them together and bound them up in parallel in this self-replicating strand, where old bits are tossed aside and new ones picked up like dust in a whirlwind. And like the whirlwind, sometimes we hit a bridge doing 60, sometimes we fall off a cliff, and sometimes we just peter out, exhausted. Death is just what happens when the whirlwind no longer has the energy to keep itself together, but on a grander scale. This is the Godless Heathen, signing off.